it's not so much resigning from work as such, is resigning from employers and looking for employers that actually are a better fit and a better partner for the ambitions that people have.
One of the biggest shifts brought on by the pandemic is the number of people who have opted to quit their jobs. The media has handily named this the Great Resignation, and whether the number of people leaving their posts is quite as high as the headlines imply, there has certainly been a surge in the number of people who are disgruntled and find their work, well, somewhat soul-crushing. Have so many companies become terrible places to work, or have employees raised their expectations as to what work should be like? Either way, what can today's leadership do to reduce turnover and create a work environment that supports both people and productivity? I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for joining me on A Seat at the Table. Each week, I sit down with industry leaders, innovators, entrepreneurs, and authors who share their experience, expertise, and insights so that we can identify steps that lead to greater success. To gain greater insight into the current situation that's driving workplace turnover, I reached out to Ralf Specht, creator of Soul System and author of Building Corporate Soul, Powering Culture and Success with the Soul System. Ralf was a founding partner of Spark 44, where he was the architect of an innovative, industry-first joint venture with Jaguar Land Rover. Under his leadership, it grew to a global revenue of $100 million plus and 1,200 employees. In this episode, Ralf talks about how companies can build stronger relationships with their teams and reduce employee turnover, why it's possible to have a workplace environment that's both competitive and supportive, and how to build a company that has soul. Before we get started, if you're looking to develop knitwear collections that customers will crave, then Spin Expo is the place to go. It's the primary exhibition for yarns and knitwear. The fair is a rich resource featuring well-edited, high-quality collections, as well as cutting-edge technical innovation, not to mention outstanding trend information that cannot be found anywhere else. You can learn more at spinexpo.com. That's www.spinexpo.com. There's also a link in the show notes. And check out our website. You can find all of the previous episodes of A Seat at the Table, the show notes, productivity tips, and lots of other useful information. You can find it at seat.fm. That's SEAT.fm. FM because it's a podcast. Now, let's sit down with Ralf and figure out how we can solve this problem of everybody resigning from their jobs. Ralf, I'm really so happy to have you on A Seat at the Table, and I think that the topics that you're focusing on are very relevant to people right now, because on the one hand, we oftentimes think about it as everybody's looking for a job, right? But at the same time, now we're facing a situation where actually many companies are very eager to get staff and to retain staff. So I think that one of the big narratives at the moment is this concept of the Great Resignation. How much of that is really a lot of people quitting, and how much of that is just sort of the media making good use of a catchy headline? But still, we know that there has been a lot of fallout since the pandemic and people being furloughed. What's your take on this? What do you see happening?
Well, Jane, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you today. And I think you're touching on a very important topic. I think this headline-making thing called the Great Resignation is real. It's real not just in the Western world. I think it's real across the world. And I think there's a number of things that were worth considering. One, actually, I think the title, the headline, The Great Resignation, is not really the right headline for what's happening. I think there was a great article, great interview with Satya Nadella and Ryan Rosansky from Microsoft and LinkedIn, both CEOs, who I think gave it a better title because they called it The Great Reshuffle.
Okay, that's good.
And the reason they named it The Great Reshuffle was that they said, well, this is their priorities. And it's not so much resigning from work as such, is resigning from employers and looking for employers that actually are a better fit and a better partner for the ambitions that people have. And when you look at that and did an interview in Time, which was very interesting, is that they tracked the percentage of all members on LinkedIn that changed their jobs in the LinkedIn profile. And looking at that data at the end of September, that number was 54% up year over year, which is significant. And when you look at another piece of research that McKinsey has done, I think you see the real reason for what's happening there, because I think what we're seeing is just something that has been brewing for probably the last decade. And I think the pandemic has basically helped to get it above sea level, actually. So the McKinsey research looked at the reasons why employees are leaving and contrasted them with what employers think the reasons are. And there you see the disconnect. And I think it's pretty obvious, it's pretty clear when you look at that. So the most important reasons that employers think why employees are leaving: adequate compensation, they're just looking for a better job, or they're poached by another company. But when you ask employees why they're leaving, the number one reason is they're not valued by the organization or not valued by their manager. They want to do something on their work-life balance and want to find some sense of belonging. So you look at the two and they're like black and white, right?
Right.
And if you understand what's happening there, then I think you really understand what's happening with the Great Reshuffle or the Great Resignation, as others call it.
It's an interesting point, and it's something, like you said, that people often overlook as to what's the real reason why people are leaving. So given that that's the situation right now, from your point of view and based on your experience, what do you think companies should be doing ideally? What should they be looking to change? What should they be looking to implement?
Well, I think when you look at the reasons why people are leaving, which, as I mentioned, not valued by the organization or not valued by the manager, these are, in theory, easy to fix issues. But obviously, they're very difficult to fix because they really tap into human behavior, which means leaders need to change and organizations need to change. Organizations only change when the leaders change their approach. I was talking to another colleague the other day, and he just came out of a session the day before with a board of directors with 13 people who asked him to help them understand to improve their corporate culture. And when everybody introduced themselves, they all had one theme. They said, well, our people are not empowered or don't feel empowered. And what shall we do? And the guy basically looked at them and said, listen, if your people don't feel empowered and you 13 guys are the leadership of this company, you are the problem. You got to fix the problem on your end. It's not about your employees, it's about you, because you got to empower. So what that example shows, I think, is that leaders need to take this very serious and need to ask themselves, what's their role in the game? In my book, Building Corporate Soul, I've developed a framework that looks at this. And in each of the chapters, there's a list of questions at the end, which I call soul searching.
Okay.
And I think this is really about soul searching and understanding what's happening inside your company. What's your role as a leader? How are you supporting what you think you want to achieve? And what do others think you're doing? And that is something that I think that much too often is overlooked. Like we've all seen employee surveys, and very often they're just being reviewed for one time when they come out, and then they're getting filed, and that was it. But actually, employee surveys are such an important tool to understand what's happening. And I can only recommend to any leader to regularly check what's happening on Glassdoor or equivalent sites about employee feedback, because it tells you something that you often don't see or you're not being told. And I think that is critical.
We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business Who hasn't had their tunnel of year? This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think you TDP, but hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
How do you square the concept of competition within a company, which oftentimes has been seen as a way to drive people forward, to build greater productivity, greater innovation, and so forth, versus the concept of this more of a, I don't know what you'd call it, a family approach to a company, right? So there's sort of two different views. How do you see that playing out now?
Well, I think the idea of competition is a valid idea. There's nothing wrong with competition, as long as it's fair competition. And I think the idea of a family inside a company is an interesting concept too, but one needs to be a bit careful with the family aspect, as obviously in families, the psychological relationships are vastly different than at the workplace. So it's not a 100% accurate comparison, but I think when you look at the right terminology, is probably a tribe rather than a family. So people that have a shared interest and ideally shared objective. And that does not exclude competition. Competition is helpful in getting to the best result. But again, it needs to be fair competition. And as long as that's happening, there's nothing wrong with competition at all.
I like the way that you refer to it as a tribe rather than a family. And I think that's a very, very important point of distinction, because you're right. Family has a very different connotation in terms of how each person will act and what other people will do for them. Do you think that in terms of avoiding some of these problems that companies are seeing, where people feel so unhappy in the company and then they're faced with how much do we need to change our culture versus maybe we're hiring the wrong people? Do you think that they need to start really a lot further upstream when they hire people and see how do we get people who are a better profile for what we're doing, who perhaps have a more similar sentiment?
I think people need to start much, much earlier. I think the question that I'm looking at in building corporate soul is, how do you build a company with soul?
Okay.
And what does that mean? And I've seen it myself, the company that I had the pleasure to be a co-founder of, Spark 44, a global joint venture with Jaguar and Land Rover for their marketing communications activities worldwide, which we took from 4 offices and 80 people to 1,200 people and 19 offices in just a few years.
Wow.
And the culture that emerged in this company was second to none, which led to, when I left as CEO, to a lot of really heartbreaking messages from my fellow colleagues. And that actually led me to write the book and develop the framework. And when you talk about the framework, there's 3 levels, I think, that companies need to understand. The first level, the centerpiece, is purpose. And purpose obviously has been the buzzword for the last 10 years. And from my perspective, it should be named shared purpose, because ever too often the purpose is just a nice phrase sitting somewhere on a shelf or behind the receptionist's table in the office, but isn't actually fully embedded into the business. Now, if you got the shared purpose, then the second level is what I call the shared understanding, which looks at all the key elements of corporate strategy. So vision, mission, values, and what I call spirit, which to me is the intended culture. And then the third level is where the rubber hits the road, because that's what I call the shared behaviors. So while you might get the purpose right and you might get the strategical elements right, it doesn't really say that much unless people in the company live it every day. And so the shared behaviors in a company are really crucial to deliver that. So you got to be clear about why you're in business. You got to be clear about where you want to go and how you want to go there. And then you got to make sure that everything you do follows that. And there are many great examples. In the book, I've looked both at startup companies and at legacy companies. From the legacy companies, I looked at Hilton and Lego predominantly. Lego is probably currently the case. They just had another record year in 20, and basically they gave all their employees an extra bonus, gave extra 3 days of vacation because they wanted to say thank you. And Lego, interestingly, is a family company. And when you look at the Interbrand Best Global Brands research, 52% of the companies of the top 100 are family-owned companies, 48% are listed companies. And the family-owned companies are taking ESG very, very seriously. And the S in G is the one piece that I think I'm focusing on in building corporate soul to making the workplace a better place.
It's interesting that you point out the difference between the culture in family-owned and in publicly owned. And I wonder, given some of the unique pressures that are on publicly owned companies, particularly those that are publicly listed, right? It's not so easy to square some of the things that you're talking about with that pressure on having to meet these quarterly targets all the time. How can those companies in particular bridge that gap? What's sort of the middle ground that they can manage?
Well, I think the family-owned businesses have one big advantage, which is obviously ideally a continued spirit throughout the existence of the company by the founder, the next generation, the following generation, and so on and so forth. But if you think that is the guarantee for companies with soul, I have to disappoint you, because there's many family-owned companies who think just because there's somebody from the family leading the company, that element of soul in the company is a given. And very often it's not, because people don't see inside the company, the employees don't see what the owner might think is implicitly there all the time. So family-owned companies have a theoretical advantage, but they actually have to leverage it and make it happen. It doesn't come just because they're family-owned. When you talk about the listed companies, that's what I've looked into at the Soul Index, which is a performance index that I've featured in the book. Microsoft is an interesting case, because you could argue that when Nadella took over from Ballmer, that was a significant shift, and he identified culture as the number one thing to deal with in taking Microsoft to the next level, which he's done perfectly well so far. But the principle is always the same. It doesn't matter whether you're a listed company, a family-owned company, a startup, or whether you've been around for 100 years. If you are not clear about why you're in business, the shared purpose, and have shared that with everyone, if you're not clear about where you want to go and have that shared with everyone, and extremely important, if you haven't adjusted all your mechanisms for hiring, for promoting, for finding partners outside the business, alongside these elements of what I call the shared purpose and the shared understanding, you're not going to make it, because for companies to build corporate soul, they need to earn that trust from their employees. And you can very clearly see, and that's why the Glassdoor and other employee platforms are so important to look at and to read. This is where you find out whether the people inside the company believe that the company has got soul or not. And very often
when you look at some of those platforms, how do you factor out the bias that people are more inclined to go online and voice an opinion when they're angry than when they're happy, right? When they're happy, they're happy. When they just got laid off, or they've had a falling out with their boss or something like that. So there's a certain bias towards disgruntled people. Not that there aren't people who are happy on those platforms as well, but how, if you were looking at it from a management point of view, how would you sort of weigh the feedback that you're getting?
The bias does exist, of course, and when you have got people who are angry because they got laid off or because there's something happening that they don't agree with. That happens, but that happens across all companies. So you have to compare against your peers and see what happens in the industry and what's happening with your company. And Lego, for instance, is a perfect example. I think the one stat was that 88% of all Lego employees agree that this is a good company. 100% have said in a recent study that they are very happy to be with Lego. And these are numbers that just don't happen by coincidence. And I think
now, if you're looking at companies in terms of being able to build this relationship with employees that they love working at the company, aside from bonuses and extra days off, are there other things, in your opinion, that companies can do?
Yeah, I think the element of bonuses and pay rises and all of these things, I'm not saying they're not important. Of course they are important. To me, there are more hygiene factors, right? I think looking back at when we started our conversation about the Great Reshuffle and the McKinsey study, what do employees want? They want to be valued. They want to see a sense of belonging, and they want to be valued by the organization and by their manager. And in my experience, and that's what I felt when we built our company, the biggest resource that we had was actually coming for free. And normally you hear leaders all the time complaining about everything is expensive and there's a cost attached to everything and all the rest of it. But there's one resource that I believe really comes for free if you do the things that you need to do anyway in the right way. And that resource is commitment, right? And commitment is a wonderful thing because commitment ensures that you've got highly engaged people inside the company, but it doesn't, I'm saying it comes for free as there is no cost attached to it, but it doesn't come for free because you're going to do a few things to make sure you gain commitment because it's like trust, you have to earn it. It doesn't come just because you say, well, let's all be committed. So you need to focus on alignment and importance. You got to bring people to the table. If people are heard, they are much more likely to be committed. You got to have transparency and visibility for others. So you got to make sure that people understand where you are, where you want to go, and how you want to get there. You got to ideally have people participate in setting the goals, because again, if they participate, it's a shared goal, so the involvement is much higher. And you got to be clear. I mean, you asked about competitiveness and competition in companies and whether that helps or not. Mm-hmm. One key element to commitment is that the people you want to be committed have to have ownership and accountability, which means in your leadership style, you have to make space for that. And the last one is obviously, and very often it gets forgotten because it's not a sexy thing, but it's very, very helpful documenting the goals and documenting whether they've been achieved or not, and or to what level is critical. And these things help significantly to make sure there is commitment. And if there's commitment, the issue of being valued by the organization is no longer an issue, it's probably a strength. And that goes a long, long, long way. And there's one company in the US called OCA who have done a wonderful study, which is their global culture index. And what I call businesses with soul, they call businesses with a thriving culture. And their index has provided great results. So they're basically saying that employees in a thriving culture are 13 times more likely to be highly engaged. The organizations have an eight times higher incidence of great work and a double likelihood to have increased revenues. And at the same time, employees in thriving cultures are experiencing 3 times less burnout situations, and the companies are 3 times less likely to face layoff. So to your point about Glassdoor and the companies, you see a bias in the results. Yes, you see a bias in the results. So the best thing you do is make sure there isn't too much bad stuff happening in your company. And I'm not talking a story about kumbaya and everybody being friends with each other. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a workplace where individuals are valued and are valued for what they bring to the table. And if they are valued, you get the commitment. If you get the commitment, you get higher engagement. If you get higher engagement, you usually get better products, you get better customers or happier customers.
So, in other words, what you're saying really is that investing in building this kind of a corporate culture has tremendous benefits, not just in employee retention, but in productivity and in a happy work environment and in sparing yourself having a lot of bad comments about the company on social media, which in its own way drags everybody down. So it's quite interesting to see that ripple effect.
Yes, yes. And I think when you start thinking about it, it's not rocket science to do it because you're doing all the things anyway. The question is, how are you doing them? And is everybody in the company aligned to where you want to go and how you want to get there? And that is a critical thing. And leaders need to be very aware of what their team leads are doing, how they're managing their teams, and so on and so forth. And as you're usually not a company on your own, but you've got associates, you've got other team leads, you've got to make sure that the people around you walk the same talk. Might be in a slightly different fashion because there's an individual element to it, but they're all aligned to the strategy and to the values and the spirit that's intended in the company.
It's an interesting point, and I can see why this would be so critical and have so many benefits, but not easy to do on a day-to-day basis when you're facing the pressures of work and the myriad of things that senior management face on a day-to-day basis. Now, you had mentioned the Soul Index that you developed. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So when I had finished writing the book, which obviously took quite a bit of time and a lot of research and reading and understanding and interpreting lots of studies and surveys, I saw a pattern there. And I saw that, interestingly, companies that were doing it right and doing it well in terms of the way they were managing their employees and their staff overall, actually had significant performance positive outbreaks. And so at the end of writing the book, when it came to an end, I actually looked at all the studies again and got to a place where I blended those studies into one performance index. Performance index is weighted 75% on employee data. So things like Glassdoor or Great Place to Work and the Glassdoor top CEO, and 25% on business performance, like Interbrands, best global brands is part of it. And an interesting mix came out. There's in the top 20, there's 5 family-owned companies or privately owned companies and 15 public companies. It's led by Adobe, head of Salesforce and Microsoft. The oldest company in the mix is Deloitte. Deloitte was founded in 1845. The second oldest company in the mix is American Express from 1850.
Wow.
The youngest company is Workday, actually, from 2005. So, and everything else in between. When we put together that index, I asked a bank to do me a favor and do a computation about the cumulative performance. And obviously with companies in there like Adobe and Salesforce and Microsoft, so tech companies, you could expect a good performance. But I was really surprised. So the Soul Index on 5-year basis, if you look 2016 to 2020, delivered 199% return. NASDAQ, which was the star on the international indices, only delivered 180. Dow Jones 75 and S&P 500 was 83.
Wow.
So And I thought that was really helpful because it in a way shows that the leadership behaviors which build success can be synonymous with the leadership behaviors that build soul. And because very often in conversations when I was writing the book, people were saying, well, it's easy to say all of that, but making it happen is obviously difficult. And I said, of course it's difficult. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it in the first place. But I think the data show that doing it actually provides a great opportunity for being successful and have happy employees at the same time. So there's no fight between happy employees and being successful.
It's an interesting correlation that you make between performance and that corporate culture that makes people feel happy to come to work, feels that they belong, feels that they're part of a mission. I think that's very interesting. I think that we talk about it a lot, but we haven't really quantified it as you have. So I think when you actually put numbers to it, it makes it a lot easier for people to see, wow, this is more than just sort of feel good kind of thing that you're supposed to say. You actually can see the value in implementing it.
Yes, and I've started the book with a quote from Charles Handy, the Irish social philosopher who worked as a professor for a long, long time. And he said, the companies that survive longest are the ones that work out what they uniquely can give to the world, not just growth or money, but their excellence, their respect for others, or their ability to make people happy. Some call those things a soul. And I think it's really true. And what I've also noticed when I was looking at the tenure of the CEOs, which obviously on an average, I think the Google tells you these days it's 6.9 years. For the top 10 companies, it's 14.6 in the mix. And for the top 20, it's even 15 years. So having a CEO running a company for a long time actually helps really build that corporate soul. And that is true for both the listed companies as well as the private companies.
That's an interesting finding, because you're right, you do tend to see that the ones with a lot of turnover at the top also have a lot of turnover further down the hierarchy, so to speak.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly right. Ralf, you've shared so many interesting things with us. Where can people find you? How can people connect with you?
Well, people can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And people can connect with me via the website, buildingcorporatesoul.com, where you can register for a newsletter. And that means you get a newsletter into your inbox every 2 weeks.
Okay. Well, I'm going to put the links for all of that in the show notes. And I want to thank you so much for taking your time. I have learned a tremendous amount from this conversation, and I'm sure that everybody listening has too.
Thank you, Jane. It was a pleasure to be on the show.
If you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table, join me each week when I sit down with industry leaders, innovators, entrepreneurs, and authors who share their expertise, experience, and insights about succeeding in business and in life. And make sure to visit Spin Expo. From trend information to technical innovation, Spin Expo is the primary exhibition for yarns and knitwear. The fair provides well-edited forums featuring high-quality products that are bursting with creativity. To learn more, go to spinexpo.com. That's www.spinexpo.com. You can also find the link in the show notes for this episode. And don't forget to check out our podcast website, where you can find all of the previous episodes of the Seat at the Table podcast, the show notes, news about our upcoming masterclass series, and lots of other useful information. You can find it at seat.fm. That's www.seat.fm. FM because it's a podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next podcast episode.